Hi, everyone. Welcome to Teach 250. I'm Bobby Caith. I am the Senior Product Manager for the National Mall Gateway. And on behalf of the Trust for the National Mall and all the other folks we're going to introduce in a few minutes, we wanted to welcome you and thank you for spending part of your Tuesday evening with us. We have an incredible program tonight. I am very excited. I'm excited, and my 6-year-old who's at home with me is very excited to watch Ranger Jen and Ranger Bethany, so we will keep this moving to get to them very soon. Thanks for being here, and I will hand it off to our friend Lindsay from Destination DC.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lindsay Hill, and I am the Director of Visitor Experience and Group Tour at Destination DC, the tourism bureau for Washington, DC. We are so excited to partner with the National Park Service, National Mall and Memorial Parks, and the Trust for the National Mall on this webinar series. Our hope is to highlight the many resources available to you from city partners, whether in classroom lesson plans, virtual workshops, or in-person tours, if you plan to come visit us this year. Because there's only one place where you can learn about the nation's founding documents for free while understanding the local perspective that informs national history, showcased through 6 crafted themes to touch on American accomplishments through history, art, science, and sports, as well as what the next 250 years will bring. Washington, D.C. has what you need to commemorate America's 250th anniversary all year long through themed itineraries, special exhibits, and iconic celebrations, all found at our microsite, dc250.us. That is dc250.us. And hopefully we will see you in 2026. Ranger Jen, we can't wait to learn tonight. I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We are super excited to share our version of America 250. We kind of were kicking around some ideas about how we could incorporate some of our stories into this anniversary. And we've got this program. We wanted to try it out with you and see what you think. Know that it's an option for your students who either may be coming to the mall. We have an on-site version of this, but we also have a virtual version. It was maybe geared towards upper elementary, but I feel like it could be tweaked for some different age groups. And if you wanted help with that, or if you wanted to work with us on that, we'd be happy to accommodate you. We think it's a kind of fun idea. Ranger Bethany is a master with this PowerPoint business. I just get to read the chat, which is what I can handle. But she is going to show you, we're going to have you all be the students tonight and show you how we would do this with a group. We've done a few already, but we wanted to try and make it as engaging as possible. So we need you all to play along with us tonight and hear some of our maybe lesser known mall stories. Maybe some of them are pretty well known, but to tie it into this idea of anniversaries and sites related to the Revolutionary War, we present to you our mysteries on the mall. So I will expect to see you all with lots of answers in the chat. Give me something to do tonight here. Say hi if you'd like and introduce yourself and tell us where you're calling in from. That would be fun too. And feel free to ask any questions you have along the way because we would love to engage and make it a little bit of a conversation. I don't know that we can actually unmute you, but feel free, please, to put your questions in the chat box, and we are happy to talk to you all about that. South Dakota in the house. How about it? Thank you, Mr. Lamb. Okay, Bethany, you ready to roll?
Absolutely.
Yay.
All right, everybody. Again, thanks for joining us this evening. When I sort of created this program, what I wanted to do is create something that was super interactive, but also something that commemorated, of course, the special year that we're celebrating this year, which is the 250th. In this case, Freedom 250 is what we sort of say here in the National Park Service. And what we decided to do, Jen and I, was to create a program that kind of presented different mysteries on the mall that connected really two things. So the first would be certain spots within the park that were connected to the American Revolution. And we actually have several. I picked the one that was probably the most iconic, the most well-known, which is the Washington Monument. But also sites that were sort of impacted by previous centennial celebrations. And so we're going to look at one that's really well-known, and then we're going to look at another one that's not so well-known. And so as we go through the program here, kind of what I envisioned in the beginning is really sort of students pulling out a piece of paper and kind of using that as their detective notebook and taking notes as they go along. So as we examine the evidence and we figure out the facts, they're sort of scribbling down notes. And so when we get to the sort of the final verdict of what we think happened, we can make that final declaration, and we can consider the case closed. And so one of the things that we're going to start off with are some vocabulary words that I think are kind of important for students to sort of just keep in the back of their mind, because this program is very sort of centered on the idea of centennials and bicentennials and semi-sesquicentennials and all kinds of centennials. I think it's sort of important to kind of figure out what all of these places or all these words means. But the first thing we always start off with, pretty much on any program that we have, especially for students who might not be familiar with Washington, D.C. and the National Mall, we always start off with that question is, what is the National Mall? Is it a shopping center? Is it a big playground? Or is it a park with monuments and memorials? And of course, that image there that you see kind of gives it away. But we want to sort of make sure that we're all on the same page, especially when it comes to the definition of the word mall, which today many of us think of shopping when we hear that word. But back when the city was being founded and the park was being created, the word mall essentially meant a public park, a place where people could gather, shaded walkways. And so if you take a look at this photograph here, you definitely see how our name came to be. And even though the definition had changed, we, are still the National Mall. So that's one kind of sort of vocabulary word we like to highlight here. And the next would be, what does the word centennial mean? And so this would kind of start our interactive part of the program. So if you all want to throw maybe in the chat box, what the word centennial means. Is it a celebration every 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years?
I always tell the kids when I'm doing the mall question that it's usually the grown-ups who get really confused. But the grown-ups are always looking for the shopping mall, not the kids. They know it. Mrs. King is right on it, 100 years.
Yeah, very good. So centennial, 100 years celebration. And then, of course, we come to our 250th, the Semiquincentennial celebration. And we sort of break it down for students as to why we call it the Semiquincentennial, with semi being half, and then quincentennial being 500 years. And so half of 500 years is, of course, going to be 250. And so that's where we get our name for this year's celebration. Okay, so then we sort of move into our first case. And our first case is F250-1, the tower that took too long. And this is a centennial mystery. So this is that 100th year commemoration. And of course, the tower that we have in Washington, D.C. is the Washington Monument. And so again, we begin the program, or the case file, I guess, if you will, by looking at some facts that we know about the Washington Monument. And the first fact we know is that it honors General George Washington. And typically here, I would ask students, general of which war? And of course, because we're looking at the 250th, general during the American Revolution. We also see that the height is sort of this weird height of 555 feet and 5 1/8 inch. And this is something that we're going to kind of keep in the back of our mind as to why they chose that specific height for the Washington Monument. It's in the shape of an obelisk. And then we also sort of on the outside kind of see these sort of strange little color changes that we have, maybe a third of the way up. That's roughly at 156 feet. We see a very prominent color change on the outside. And then we look at our construction years, which is 1848 to 1884. And even though we're looking in the 1800s, this does seem like an incredibly long time to finish the Washington Monument. And ultimately, it's roughly 36 years. And so our first question, the first thing we're going to try and figure out, our first mystery, is why did it take so long to build the Washington Monument? Again, keeping these facts kind of on the back of our mind, or anything that we sort of jotted down that we think might be important as we move along here. So our first clue in discovering why it took so long to build the Washington Monument is that it was being built by a private society known as the Washington National Monument Society. And this group really wanted this to be, in many ways, a people's monument. And so they wanted donations. Instead of accepting a large donation, maybe from the federal government or from an organization, they wanted to give the people of the United States an opportunity to help build this monument to commemorate General George Washington. And so they decided in the beginning that they were going to limit the amount of money that one person could donate each year. So our first question that we need to think about is, well, how much money was that? Was that $1, $2, or $5? And sometimes this question does trip students up a little bit as we sort of think in 2026 terms, and we're thinking about money. The value of money has changed a little bit over the course of time. And so quite often students do sometimes struggle with this question a little bit. But what do you all think? $1, $2, or $5? What was the cap?
Our majority is saying, oh, here comes another one. Oh, 5, a couple 5s and a couple 1s.
Okay, yeah, let's see what the answer is. Yeah, so it was actually $1. And here's Ranger Jen making her contribution to the Washington Monument. So it was $1 per year. And if we sort of think about that, even in the 1800s, maybe $1 is not going to go as far as the society hoped that it would. And so eventually, excuse me, they're going to get rid of this cap. But in the beginning, because they wanted everyone to be able to contribute, everyone was limited to $1. And sometimes you would get this kind of neat little certificate here that Ranger Jen had sent to her. And if you look sort of down there on the bottom, you'll notice that it has the signature of the president, which in this case is Millard Fillmore. So you got a nice little souvenir. So our second clue is that the society themselves originally had people sort of going out door to door to collect money from people that not only lived in Washington, D.C., but lived in neighboring states. But eventually they decided that maybe it would be more efficient to place these little canisters in public places that people frequented, like post offices or libraries. Places like that. And so you could contribute whatever dollars, whatever money you wanted to, again, sort of lifting that cap after a while. And when they originally started doing this, donations were coming in at a pretty steady pace. And so by July 4th of 1848, the society felt that they had enough money to at least start construction of the Washington Monument. So on that day, they began building pretty steadily for the next 6 years. Unfortunately, though, by the time they reached about 156 feet in 1854, something would happen that would cause them to stop construction altogether. So our second question is, what happened in 1854 that made them stop working? Did they run out of money? Did the monument fall over? Or did the Civil War begin?
I was just talking to folks out there the other day about this picture and how flat the ground is around the monument. It's just a really neat image if you've ever had to walk up that hill
Yep, it's
to
true.
see it like this. We have a whole bunch of A's and a C.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
see. Yeah, so the reason that they stopped in 1854 is they actually did run out of money. As they're approaching the 1850s, the economy isn't doing so great, and people are unable to contribute. And so those donations started to trickle in instead of pour in. And by 1854, the society sort of found themselves broke, and they can no longer afford to continue to build the monument. And so it's going to sit there for quite a while, really up until the 1870s. Now, the Civil War does play a role, probably in extending the amount of time that the Washington Monument remained incomplete, but it's not the reason that they stopped working. And it's going to be during the Civil War that the monument kind of comes back into focus a little bit, because not only do Civil War soldiers parade and train on the grounds of the Washington Monument, cattle is often seen out roaming around as they brought the cows in to feed the troops. And so many people began to refer to the Washington Monument as the Beef Depot Monument. Sometimes it's called a stump, and even I've read a couple of descriptions where people refer to it as a chimney. So even, in the 1860s, it's becoming a little bit of an eyesore that you still, after all this time, don't have a completed monument dedicated to the life and legacy of George Washington. It's just sort of sitting there while the city grows around it. And you may have seen this photograph before, but I think this is a really good photograph to see kind of how the park and sort of the city has evolved over the course of time. Because if you look at the Washington Monument in this picture, what don't you see?
Ah, Carol said the reflecting pool.
Yeah, so there's no reflecting pool. Yeah, very good. There's no Lincoln Memorial. Yeah, behind it, it's the river. And so ultimately that river is going to have to be pushed back to create the land in which things like the reflecting pool and the Lincoln Memorial will ultimately be built upon. And so the city grows and it changes, and there's the Washington Monument sort of witnessing all of this, still roughly at 152, 156 feet, sort of watching all this happen around it. Again, for the simple reason is the society didn't have enough money to continue building. Okay. So our third clue sort of centers around the design of the Washington Monument. So originally, the monument was meant to look much, much different. So this was the design by Robert Mills, who was actually chosen to design the Washington Monument. And here is basically where I would ask students to point out some differences between the monument that we have today and the original design of what they sort of envisioned would be out here on the National Mall. So if anybody wants to point out a difference, or even something that kind of looks the same.
There's some typing going on here. Hang on. Huh. It looks like the Washington Monument is on the Lincoln Memorial. That's a
That's
great
interesting.
observation.
It really is. It really
Super
is.
tall, the official architecture term. I love it. The base is more elaborate. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Kind of would have liked to seen that base. That might have been fun.
Yeah, and so the original design for the monument was meant to be a lot more elaborate or ornate, I guess, if you will. And a couple of the big differences, first, if you look at the top, it's more of a flat roof as opposed to the pyramid that we have sitting on top of the monument today. There actually was meant to be an inscription written on the outside. And I've done this program a couple of times for students, and most of them ask if that's a like a thumbprint, a fingerprint, because it kind of does look like it when you're looking at it from kind of a distance. And then if you look below that, you'll notice that there's a statue of George Washington in a chariot of all things. And then, of course, the other really big difference is that colonnade building that we have at the base of the Washington Monument. Yeah, it kind of looks like you sort of have a circular Lincoln Memorial with a monument sitting on top of it. Now, inside that colonnade, they meant to place statues of people that George Washington worked with, people that Washington knew. Think of Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, maybe James Madison would find his way in there. Certainly some of the generals that served with Washington during the Revolutionary War. And so all of that would be, on the inside and the outside of the Washington Monument. So it looks very different than what it does today. So the question then becomes, is why did they change the original design? What was the reason for this? Was it because they didn't have enough stone? Was it too expensive? Or was it because Washington didn't like the design?
We got a bunch of B's. Oh, we got a C. We got an A.
Interesting.
Got the whole gamut here.
The whole gamut. All right, let's see. So the actual reason was it was simply too expensive. They just didn't have, the society just never had enough funding to be able to build the monument as it was originally envisioned. And so that's one of the reasons that they kind of got rid of all of this flashy stuff on the outside and built more of a plain, simple Egyptian obelisk. One of the things that I always like to point out to students here, though, with this question, especially the answer of C, Washington didn't like the design. One of the reasons that Washington has a monument as opposed to a memorial is that the idea to commemorate him was there when he was still alive. Now, they didn't really have much of a vision of what that would look like. Maybe it's a statue of Washington on his horse. They hadn't even started building anything yet, but because the idea was there, and really because there's kind of a placeholder on the original map of Washington for something to George Washington, he gets a monument as opposed to a memorial. So it would have been interesting to see what George Washington would have thought of a design like this, and whether or not he would like the original design or whether or not he'd like the simple monument that we have dedicated to him today. And then again, the answer of didn't have enough stone. And some of this I would explain to students, some of it I wouldn't. That's the reason that we have the color change, was because they went to a different quarry, which changed the color of the stone a little bit. But ultimately, it was all about money. And so if we kind of do an evidence check, a recap of some of the clues, some of the questions that we looked at, they're all going to have something they're going to have something in common, and it's all going to be about money. So originally donations were limited to $1. They stopped building in 1854 because they ran out of money. And they changed the design because it was simply too expensive to build the monuments in the way that they had envisioned. And so if we sort of put all these things together, why did it take 36 years to build the Washington Monument? Well, it was all about this idea of money. A lot of students will say, well, that seems kind of like a silly reason, and it kind of was. And there's a great lesson perhaps to be learned here. Make sure you have all the money in place before you start building. But the society was never able to do that, no matter how much they tried and how many different tricks they used. They simply never had enough. So we know why it took so long. So the question then becomes, well, what does the centennial perhaps have to do with the Washington Monument? Well, if we kind of piece it all together, so how did the Washington Monument finally get finished? And a lot of it had to do with the approaching centennial. In 1876, cities and towns, especially here along the East Coast in Philadelphia and Boston and New York, are planning these big elaborate celebrations for the country's birthday. And here in Washington, they're sort of looking at what celebration they could create. And they're in the sort of the heart of the city. They still have this unfinished monument to George Washington, not only the general of the American Revolution, but ultimately the first president. And so this brings the monument sort of back into sort of the minds and the attention of the people in Washington. And so they began to talk about, well, what can we do? And at the time, they really had three choices. The first choice was they could simply dismantle the monument that had already been built and to use that material to design something new. The second would be to leave it at that height that it was standing at that point, to put a roof over it because they didn't add one when they stopped building. So for quite a long time, rain and snow and everything else is sort of pouring into the Washington Monument. So add a roof and maybe put a statue of Washington on top of it, or they could, of course, finish the Washington Monument. And that's what we know they did today. And again, you can see in this picture, we have this sort of really interesting color change on the outside to remind us of why it took so long to build the Washington Monument. So that is our first case. Before we move on, does anybody have any questions before we go to case number 2?
Guess they're all worn out from solving that case.
If you do have any questions, go ahead and throw it in the chat box as we move on. We can definitely answer them. Okay, so now we're going to look at our second case.
Oh, I got one for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Were there presidents who really pushed to have this completed?
So I think there were some presidents who sort of looked out their window at the White House and you know, were visibly reminded of this unfinished Washington Monument. And, you know, probably wondered what to do about the situation. I know that Grant kind of got involved to some degree. But yeah, I mean, it was one of these things where there were a lot of individuals who sort of influenced getting the Washington Monument finished. And it was a period of time. So the monument wasn't finished for the centennial. You know, it's not until the 1880s that eventually it gets opened back up. So it's quite a you know, a number of years from the time they start to revisit it to the time that it's actually completed. And some of that had to do with the foundation work. Some of that had to do with convincing the Washington National Monument Society to turn the project over to the federal government and bring in the Corps of Engineers to really finish the monument. And so there were a couple of presidents that would be involved in that process, or the mid 1870s to the I guess the mid 1880s. Yep. All right. So we're going to move on to our second case here. So I called this the case of the vanishing buildings. And this is going to be one of our bicentennial mysteries. And this is an area that Ranger Jen, she really likes our next case. So we're going to look at a series of buildings that once really sort of overwhelmed the National Mall in particular, and sort of look at, well, what happened to these buildings. But before we do that, we got to look at a vocabulary word. So our next mystery moment is, what does the word bicentennial mean? Is it every 125 years, 150, or 200?
You said bicentennial, and all I heard was bison.
Oh, sorry.
Totally went in
Bicentennial.
a different direction. I think we're all pretty united on this one. See,
Yeah. Jen kind of makes fun of me that a lot of my answers in these PowerPoints are always C.
yeah.
So yeah, so every 200 years, bicentennial. And so we began with, again, with our facts on file. And we're going to look at these buildings that I just sort of highlighted in blue on this image here. And for a very long time, these were kind of referred to as the main Navy or munitions buildings. And so I kind of asked the students at that point, if it's the main Navy buildings, who would be using them? And it's, of course, the military is going to be occupying most of the space here. You'll notice that they're located near the reflecting pool and the Washington Monument. There were government office buildings, basically. And the one really interesting fact that we know about these buildings are the years that they were in use. This was about 53 years. And if we take a look at the very first date, 1918, what was happening in that year that would sort of require DC to sort of look around and see what sort of office space they either have available or land that they could build additional office space on. It's 1918.
They're on it. World War I.
Yeah, very good. So World War I, sort of this influx of military personnel that are coming into the city to help direct and help out during the war effort. And there has to be some place for them to work, and to some degree, some place for them to live as the years go on. And so looking at our facts, where did these buildings go? Why aren't they there anymore? Because it always seems, to some degree, at least in the early part of Washington, D.C., there always seemed to be a need for office space. All right, so our first clue is centered around this gentleman right here. And I'm sure you all know who he is, but this tends to sometimes trip up students. Who are we looking at here?
They recognize the young and dashing FDR.
This is FDR. One of the things that I really like about this picture, if you look at his eyeglasses, when we bring students to the FDR Memorial, FDR has eyeglasses on, and they don't have the earpieces. It's just the piece that sits over his nose. And they're always asking questions about what happened to his eyeglasses. And so you can actually see it really well here in this picture. So this is, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is one of the statues that we have in this memorial. So this is a very worn out Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he's president there. But this is a very young, as you said, very handsome FDR, who at this point is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he's going to be given a pretty big assignment. He's going to be the one that's going to be asked to figure out, where are we going to put all of these workers coming into Washington, D.C. And Roosevelt is kind of concerned about what the outcome is going to be with this assignment that he's given. And so he decides that if we're going to build these buildings in Washington, we need to consider three things. The first is that they need to be made out of wood. The second is that they should be plain and odd looking, especially so they don't compete with any of the monuments and memorials that are already out there. And third, he decides that they need to be built on the ellipse, which if students aren't familiar with where that is, you can see on this picture, it's that round sort of space in front of the White House there. So the question is, why did FDR want these buildings to be made of wood? He wants them to be odd looking and plain. And why did he want them to be built on the ellipse? What was his reasoning for these things? Was it so that they could be super fancy near the president? Was it so that they would be removed once the war was over? Or was because it was the only material and location available at the time?
Every good detective needs a magnifying glass, right? I love that part. That's
I do
great.
like the magnifying glasses, yeah.
That was pretty good, yeah. Looks like a sweep of bees.
Yeah, very good. Bees. FDR even remarked once that he was afraid that his legacy or his reputation was going to be ruined because he was going to be building these office buildings, on the National Mall. And he was hoping that if they would be placed, sort of in front of the White House on this ellipse, that there's no way that they would ever be kept once the war was over. And they even started referring to them as the TIMPOs, or the temporary naval and munition buildings. Unfortunately for FDR, they weren't so temporary because these buildings stuck around, as we saw, for quite some time. And not only did they stick around, they started to expand. And so if you look at this picture here, you'll notice that we've got the original building still over here on the sort of the right side of the picture. But they've also crossed over to the other side of the reflecting pool. They are across the street on the Washington Monument grounds. And they even built these nice little bridges across the reflecting pool so that workers could get from one side to the other without having to go all the way around the reflecting pool. And so these buildings, again, are everywhere. They're also on the opposite side of the Washington Monument. So this is where the American History Museum would be, one of the Smithsonian's that you see there. And you can kind of see the Natural History Museum is already built. And they're even on the National Mall down by the Capitol building. And this little complex here had its own power plant right in the middle of it, where they could burn coal to essentially heat all of the buildings that they have there. And so, again, not so temporary. Not only are the original buildings still there, but all of these buildings start to expand everywhere, and they're becoming a little bit of an eyesore after a while, especially as the city is looking to sort of grow and change and beautify into some way. And kind of think of what would happen if all of these buildings were still here. I mean, you can see, that they basically take up a lot of space where we have memorials today, especially in the Lincoln Memorial area. And then on the National Mall, they're taking some space where we've got the Smithsonian museums. So they're becoming a little bit of a problem, right? And the sort of, again, the third clue we have, when you think of a National Mall, and specifically when you think of a national park, is this what you envision? Do you envision all of these office buildings and parking spaces everywhere? Or if we think about that original definition of mall, do we think about a public park that's got all of these wide open shaded walkways and spaces where people can gather? I doubt that there's much gathering happening if we really sort of look at this picture. And so if we kind of compare that to what we've got today, this is more of what was sort of expected, I guess, if you will, of a national park, a public park, the National Mall. And one sort of interesting connection as well, the temporary buildings also started to impact some of the historic events that took place, on the National Mall. And so does anybody know what historic event is being shown here in this picture? Is it a presidential inauguration? Is it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom? Or is it the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial?
Now I can't tell if this was the last question or not. I think they're all bees.
Bees, yeah. This is definitely the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Of course, this is where Dr. King gave his very iconic I Have a Dream speech, which we have marked or inscribed on the Lincoln Memorial today. But there was another very important member of the march who was meant to sing the national anthem at the beginning. And unfortunately, she couldn't get there, not only because the crowds were overwhelming, but because these buildings were actually creating an issue of people actually getting down to the Lincoln Memorial. And so Marian Anderson, who also had, played a very important role at the Lincoln Memorial, was kind of her ability to get there was impeded in some ways by all of these old office buildings that were still on the north side of the reflecting pool. And so they were becoming a problem. And so if we kind of look at our evidence here, it's a little different than our evidence check that we have before. But we do know the first clue is that they were meant to be temporary. No matter how long temporary would be, how many years that would be, they were never supposed to be a permanent feature on the National Mall. We also know that there were a lot of them all over the place. And the third thing is they didn't really fit into what we sort of think of when we kind of consider a national park. So if we look at all of these things and we sort of put them together and we see what they have in common, why did these buildings vanish? Well, they vanished because so the area could look more like the park that we know and love today. You can see all of the monuments and memorials that were built and museums that were built where these buildings originally stood. And sort of the National Mall is this wide open space, again, where people can gather and walk to commemorate, to celebrate, to do all kinds of things without having to sort of navigate around all of these old sort of rundown office buildings that used to populate the park. So piecing it together, what did the bicentennial have to do with these vanishing buildings? Well, one of the reasons that, or one of the things that they decided to do when they decided to get rid of them, which was in the 1960s and 1970s, was they wanted to replace it with a very sort of, again, a man-made, but a natural looking spot. So you can see the buildings were taken away, and this big sort of kidney-shaped pond, which we are in the process of cleaning right now, was put in its place. And this pond was called Constitution Gardens, not only because it sat next to Constitution Avenue, but this road right here, but in some ways to honor and commemorate the Constitution itself. And Con Gardens is, again, this place that it's kind of natural. You can go and see all kinds of wildlife. It's sort of a nesting ground for a lot of the birds that we have in the park. It also used to be one of the few places that you could actually fish. At one point, it was stocked with very small sunfish, bluegill fish such as that. And quite often we would have fishing days. So we would bring students out and sort of teach and give them an opportunity to try their hand at fishing. And if there's one of our rangers, we were kind of debating which ranger this might be, fishing out on Constitution Gardens. But the other thing is, in the middle of Constitution Gardens, there is a memorial. And it's a memorial to the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. And this was a gift from the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration of 1976. And so kind of here's our connection to the bicentennial. In the middle of Constitution Gardens is what we often refer to as Signers Island. And on Signers Island, there are 56 blocks of stone that have the name of someone who signed the Declaration, along with just a little bit of information about them, what their job was, where they were from. And of course, because of Ranger Jen, I had to choose John Adams there. And a lot of times when we bring students out to this part, we see how many of them they recognize. We ask how many of them, would ultimately go on to be presidents, and certain things like that. And so here we've got, again, two mysteries on the mall, two cases that are associated with not only with the American Revolution, but also associated in some way with previous centennial celebrations. And so really sort of finally, the final mystery moment is that we would ask students, is what do we call the 300th anniversary? Is it a terse centennial? Is it a 3-centennial? Or is it a tri-anniversary?
Looking like A's.
Yeah, the tercentennial, very good. And then, the follow-up question to this would be, what does that celebration look like? This year, we're celebrating, we're creating all kinds of different celebrations, whether it's a parade or fireworks. And what would a 300th anniversary sort of look like, not only here in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall, but certainly where students live. How would they celebrate, and what would that celebration sort of look like? All right, so that's kind of the program that we have. And as Ranger Jen said, we have both this sort of virtual program, but we also have, if you live nearby, we have one that you could bring your students to. And not only do we discuss these two places, but there's also 2 other places that we will visit. For that on-site programming there. And let me see if I can get out of here.
Throw out real quick that we have a school group that likes to do a revolutionary program every year. So we have a little bingo game that we play out on Signers Island. I usually am there because I kind of like it out there. And they have to do full card bingo. It's none of this, one line or the other kind of thing. You have to fill the card. There's 9 things on there, which 2 brothers from, what's the last name of the 2 brothers from Virginia, and pick one of the South Carolina guys, and who had the biggest signature, and who's got a memorial on the mall. And the hardest one every year is which state had the most signers. Does anybody know which state had the most signers? Got to be some history geeks on here. Don't let me forget. I have another thing for you here from Dikey you have to hear. So Virginia is the guess that most of the students come up with, because the island is in a semicircular formation, and the walkway cuts through the middle. And so you see on the bottom that the names of the states are all written there. But because they cut through the middle, they break up one of the states. And so if you think to where all of the action happened when it came to writing our documents, yes, indeed, it was Pennsylvania, but half of them are on one side and half of them are on the other. So Virginia had 7 signers and Pennsylvania had 9. Your little trivia for the day. Deggy shared there is still 1 tempo on the mall, the Liberty Loan Building,
Yes.
along the banks of the tidal basin.
Yeah.
So we couldn't get rid of all of them, could we? Does anybody have any questions, any feedback, any thoughts of whether you think this would work with your students? Anything at all that you want to share or have questions about? This is awesome. What a great program. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, so good. We got the 6-year-old age group. Yay. Yeah, so we record all of these programs, and there's a link in the chat now if you've missed any of them, and if you'd like to see some of the old programs. If you have thoughts or suggestions or ideas for us on future programs, we'd love to hear that. You can find all the other DC resources in the chat as well. So unless anybody has any other questions, we really appreciate you joining us tonight, and hope you'll be here. Lindsay, help me out. Who's next month?
We will have special guests from the National Building Museum.
National Building Museum is going to join us next month. So yeah, join us next month. Usually the end of the month, Tuesdays, but we were worried about spring break next week and thought we would squeeze this one in here. So thank you all very much. And please let us know if there's anything we can do for you or your students. We're happy to help. Thank you all. Thank you to the Trust for hosting us again. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.